Hello friends, welcome to our lecture series on CSR, and in this very series of lectures on CSR I am going to present before you the basic difference between the standards, norms, value system, principles, code of conduct, and the way these different terms are being used in the field of CSR across the globe, and what is the opinion of researchers in this field. That is also I am going to present before you, and I'll be telling you what are the different bases on the basis of which we are going to classify these CSR activities, these norms, these standards, in order to have a greater amount of clarity on the subject. So let us begin our discussion with the researchers' opinion. What do they think about making use of this term standard and norms? So they are saying that although companies are adopting standards in their CSR operations, but they are increasingly using the term norms in order to indicate their this very fundamental principle which they are adopting, that is called standards. So despite the fact that I am adopting or implementing standards in my company for my CSR operations, but I don't call them standards, I basically call them as norms for my company. So what is their say on, what is the say of different researchers on this topic? That is what I am going to present before you. And most of the researchers, they feel that standard is basically used frequently in the field of CSR, but better term can be norm, and they are having a logic for it, because they are saying that given the significant differences between the companies emanating or originating from sectoral, regional, cultural and historical differences, it is very much unlikely that standardization, any kind of standardization can be done to this process, or even if it is not desirable for companies to do so. So they feel that in place of using standards, the norm, the term norm can be a better option to have a greater or have a better reflection of what you are doing into your CSR operations. If I have to quote one of the leading researcher in this field, the Gemma Krins, formerly of Nanrod University, according to the researcher, the majority of the so-called CSR standards are in fact a series of norms. So this researcher wanted to say that according to Gemma, it was basically standards are basically a compilation of series of norms which you have implemented for your company, and the ability of these norms to catalyze and encourage different approaches among companies is a theme to be studied. According to the researcher, it is basically a theme to be studied, and it is something which we need to explore as a researcher. And when you are going to study it, basically there is a challenge in front of people who are interested in the field of CSR. It is going to be a challenging domain for them to study, that how to whether these norms are basically they are able to catalyze and encourage different approaches among companies. So it is basically a theme to study according to these researchers. So they are saying that you cannot have a standard operating principle for different types of companies which are coming from different sectors, which are operating in different geographical locations, which have different orientations, which have different sets of stakeholders, and they are having their different sets of expectations. So one size fit all approach cannot be worked there. So you have to have a customized system wherein you are customizing according to your requirement. So according to those researchers who are basically who actually did their work or dedicated their work in the field of CSR standards or norms, they were of opinion that in place of standardizing the entire process, it should have a flexibility, fair amount of flexibility, wherein the companies can customize according to customize their codes of conduct or even standards according to their own requirements. Now coming to the categories of codes and standards, that what are the different categories of codes and standards, and that is why I am not going to have a differentiation between the two. We will be talking about both together, and I would say that given the definition of codes and standards, which are often vague and blurred, and one of the best ways to define codes is to categorize them. The best way is that we can classify them. In place of finding difference between the two, it is always good categorize, to classify them, to reclassify them, that there are different bases, and that would offer a greater amount of clarity to us as a learner on this topic, that what can be the best way. So it is important to note that codes and standards may fall into more than one category. You can find one code or standard in one category, and similarly the presence of the same is available in the other category also. So there can be what you can say is, you may consider it to be an overlapping, but I would say that it is having presence at both the places in both the classifications. That is what we have to understand. So given the complexity, cross-cutting nature of these codes and standards, you can classify them on the basis of two broad bases. First is, what is their focus, what is their purpose, whether they are focused on process or performance or both. I would say whether while implementing my codes and standards, I am focused on what is my purpose, whether I am focused on the process, the way it is implemented, or I am interested on the result of it, that what is the outcome of it, or I am equally concerned about the both, not only the process but also the performance. So this is what is the first basis. This can be the first basis for classifying those codes and standards, wherein we can categorize them. So a company can have a purpose or focus on process as well as performance, or some companies can be there where they feel that we have to simply perform our duties and we are concerned with the process only. Whatever is the outcome, that is something which we feel that it should be left to the society to explore and to understand, as far as CSR is concerned. The second classification, the second way of categorizing, they can be the way in which they are being developed, whether they are developed unilaterally, bilaterally or multilaterally. So the way these codes and standards are being crafted or drafted, what is the approach in drafting or crafting those standards, that also can become a base for classifying these codes and standards. It can be unilateral, it can be bilateral, or it can be multilateral. So on these two bases we are going to discuss in detail, that what kind of categorization we can have on the basis of focus or purpose, and of course the way in which they are being developed. So let us start with the first category, that whether I am talking about the scope, they cover human rights, labor and or environment, what is their stakeholders focus. So based on different orientations we can have some classifications. So different types of categories are important. Why it is important? Why do we go for having this kind of categorization? Before I proceed to the categorizations or different bases, let us first understand that why this kind of categorization is needed. Why is it important? We can have the first reason to my mind is, we can have a comparison of codes and standards. We can compare them. We can it can increase our understanding of how codes complement one another. They are not competitive to each other, but they are complementary to each other. We can determine which may be considered as competitive, which one is complementary. That is what we can decide. So the objective is to understand to what extent they are complementary to each other, to what extent they are competitive in nature. We can have a very good or you can say sound or factual comparison of codes and standards if we have this kind of categorization. So let us start with the first classification by focus. What is my focus while implementing this CSR activity? So CSR codes and standards can be divided into two key categories. If I take two broad categories, I would say the first is those companies which focus on performance, that is outcome, and others who only focus on process. Or sometimes you may find a company which is focusing on both, not only the performance but also the outcome. If I look at performance oriented codes, they basically define minimum standards of what constitutes socially responsible behavior. So performance oriented codes, if you read any of the performance code oriented codes, you would find that they are having the minimum standards of your behavior which can be treated or considered as socially responsible behavior. And if I have to give an example of it, I would say that companies should prohibit child labor and discrimination. So any kind of discrimination, if I'm saying that my company is not discriminating among any of the stakeholders or any of the customers, then of course that can be a value system which my company is following, and at the same time it became the code of conduct for my employees who are operating in the company. And the same can become the same can be taken as a benchmark of all our performances. So companies should prohibit child labor. It means we are not going to encourage any child working in our company. Rather, we are going to prohibit this very problem of society, that we are going to have to prohibit child labor, because the best place for children are schools where they have to study, rather than calling them at workplace and exploiting them. That is not the norm of a that cannot be a norm of a healthy society, where we have to take care of the stakeholders, all the stakeholders, where we have to set an example, we have to set a benchmark. So this can be, if I say that performance oriented codes are to be exemplified, the best example can be prohibition of child labor. Among the key performance instruments, if we look at the global standards, I would say that the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, that is OECD, which is a very popular kind of organization, the guidelines, their guidelines, OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, and the United Nations Global Compact, they are basically regarded as the key performance instrument. They are increasingly used by the companies across the world, because they have set a global standard for across the globe, and they are basically regarded as a foundation standard that which every company or every country is willing to adopt, because they are well thought, well discussed, deliberated and documented standards. So any country which is willing to adopt, of course it is quite easy for them to adopt in their own company as well as the country. So these tools are basically related to the focus of corporate responsibility and the desired outcomes which that companies are working towards. So they are not only talking about social responsibility, but they are talking about corporate responsibility as a term. So in broader perspective, what is the responsibility of a company? So it may relate to, it may include that social aspect also, but of course apart from that social, the economic aspect of business is also being included when we talk about the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. So it can become a key performance instrument for a company. Now moving to the process oriented standards, wherein we are going to have standards which are having orientation towards processes. As the term itself is indicating, if I am a company which is believing into process oriented standards and guidelines, I would say that I would define the procedures of my company which my employees should follow. For instance, if I say that social reporting and stakeholders consultation, that is going to be a standard or a guideline for my employees, of course they are going to follow. So they have to go for social reporting. If some employee is shouldered with the responsibility of social activities, they have to go for social reporting, and at times they may have to consult with the stakeholders also. So that can be a process oriented standard. If I have to take global examples, the key instrument or key examples of process oriented tools, if you ask me that what can be that tool, as we have already discussed about the GRI, Global Reporting Initiative, that can be regarded as one of the leading or the most sought after process oriented tool, wherein the company is supposed to report. So the GRI is basically a comprehensive reporting system. We have already discussed in the previous lectures on the topic, where we discussed in detail about what is GRI, what is expected from us when we are adopting GRI. If we talk about the accountability 1000 series, it can be AA 1000 and the international standards organizations ISO 14001. So they can also be regarded as one of the process oriented tools which are increasingly used by the companies operating across the globe. These instruments basically they relate to how of CSR. They don't they basically indicate the way it has to be achieved, how to implement are CSR plans. So these standards, these standards are, I would say, this global reporting initiative, accountability series, accountability 1000 series, international standard organization ISO 14000. These are basically telling you the how about of CSR, how to go for it. That is what they are indicating. That is why they are classified as a tool if on the basis of process oriented standards. Now coming to classification by the focus, it is really important to note that these categories are not mutually exclusive. When I say that we are going to classify on the basis of the focus, I am not saying that they are not mutually exclusive. Some standards, if you wish to know, I would like to quote here that some standards, for instance, social accountability, that is SA 8000, it may include both processes as well as performance requirement. That is why at the very outset I said you have to decide as a company whether your focus is on your objective only, or your focus is on the process also, your focus is on the purpose only, or your focus is on performance only, or you are willing to take care of both process as well as purpose as well as performance. So for them, you will find the presence of social accountability standards, that is SA 8000, which includes not only process but also performance requirements. So if you look at the process oriented and performance oriented standards, you would find that some of them, they are regarded as the foundation of or they are basically certification standards. So they are regarded as being foundation, and or why I am saying and or, because at times in one role they are basically acting as a process oriented classification. On the other, you would find the purpose also, then performance as well. So foundation standards lay basically the groundwork for a new field. When you find a foundation standard and the field is entirely new, so in place of doing research on your own and finding the ways and means to implement that CSR, it is always better to go as per the global standards. So they are basically regarded as the best practices in that emerging area, and the various international labor organizations, that is ILO conventions, and the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, they are the best example of foundation standards. So if you really wish to know about the foundation standards, it is always advisable to go as per ILO conventions, their conventions, and OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. They are basically regarded as the foundation standards, because when there was no standard, there was no norm, there was no mandate for the corporate responsibility, or what you call as corporate social responsibility, then too long back we got these guidelines by OECD and ILO. So certification standards, if you look at any of the certification system, what they expect from us, they expect that if you are following those standards, if you are adopting those standards into your operations, then only you will get certification. So the outcome is supposed to be ensured. So they expect from us that we have to follow that specific process. The systems is the systems, the kind of systems you have to implement, where the guidelines set by the standard can be implemented or is implemented properly, and after successful fulfillment or adoption of those standards only, we are going to get a certification. So if you are complying with the certain criteria and you pass an external and independent audit, you have to go through that audit, and once you get clearance from the auditor, then only the certificate is being awarded. So I would say that SA 8000 or ISO 14000, they are basically the best examples of certification standards. So these certification standards are, since they are issued by a certificate issuing authority, and they have their own sets of rules and principles. If you implement and you qualify through that audit process, then of course you are going to get a certificate. So here your classification is by focus. Your focus is not only on purpose but also on the operations, because without operations you cannot get this certification. So you have to perform, you have to showcase, you have to show that this is what you have done. Now the next classification can be classification by method of development, the way those rules and regulations are being crafted or drafted by a company. So that method of development can also become a basis for classification. So codes standards or guidelines, whatever nomenclature you assign to them, they can be classified also according to the way in which they have been crafted. And if we look at the way they are being designed, there can be multiple ways. It can be unilateral. There can be unilateral codes which are being developed by a company. So it is a company specific code which your company has implemented. So that is why we call it unilateral codes. They are basically developed by a company. Usually if you talk about unilateral codes, there is some level of dialogue with key stakeholders, but company has ultimate responsibility for the code. So you cannot say that it is bilateral or multilateral. Company is having its own standards. They can have some requisite level of dialogue with other significant stakeholders, but of course the ultimate responsibility, or eventually the company is responsible for those codes of conducts which are implemented, and they are basically regarded as a branded codes. Why do we use this term branded codes? Because they are acting as a tool to differentiate the operations of one company with that from the other, and that is what is the role of a brand, that you are able to differentiate the product of one company from that of the other. So this is the reason why do we call them branded codes, because they are basically designed or developed by a company itself, and they are implemented in that company only. If you ask me to exemplify, I would say that the most popular one, the branded code can be Nike's code of conduct, or the Shell's business principle. The company Shell, it has also has come up with some business principles for its own operations. So that can be regarded as branded codes, and because they are basically specific to that company which has actually developed it and implemented it. Now from unilateral we'll move on to bilateral codes. They are basically signed between the two parties, as the term itself is indicating bilateral. Bi means you have two parties at least. So you have two parties, there is a presence of two parties. So it is signed by two parties. A framework agreement between a trade union and a company can be an example of a bilateral code, that your company has created a framework agreement, and there is and you have got it signed. There is an agreement between the trade union and the company, and of course that is going to be a bilateral code, that there are certain do's and don'ts for the company, and of course the same is for the employees also. So they have signed an agreement, and that is why we call it bilateral codes. If you ask me for an example of it, the IKEA's framework agreement and Inditex framework agreement, these are the two companies which I could find in the relevant literature, that IKEA has its own framework agreement, and Inditex is also a company which has got its own framework agreement for this bilateral codes related to CSR activities of the company. Moving on to multilateral or multi-stakeholder codes, I would like to first reiterate that, as the term itself is indicating, where the multiple parties are involved. In unilateral, company has developed its own standards, its own code of conduct, and implemented it. In bilateral, you have two parties. Just like I gave you an example of a framework agreement between the trade union and the company. The third one is multilateral. They are basically developed by a network of organizations through extensive negotiations. So you have a network of organizations where they are having extensive negotiations and they are implementing. If you ask me about multilateral or multi-stakeholder codes, I would give you the best example, the best suitable example to it is SA 8000. And also the ethical trading initiative base code, ETA, we call it ETI, ethical trading initiative base code, which is indicating towards the way you have to go for ethical trading. So you can have on the basis of the parties involved also, you can have a classification: unilateral, the way it is being crafted or drafted, unilateral, multilateral, bilateral. So these were the three classifications. Now the question comes, what is the statement, what the World Bank has to say about multilateral codes? It is very interesting to know what is the opinion of World Bank on multilateral codes. If we look at the statement, it says that multi-stakeholders initiatives are basically the efforts to bring diverse stakeholders together around a set of an agreed principle in the area of labor, human rights or the environment. So they are saying that this initiative is basically considered as an effort in bringing diverse stakeholders together to one point where they agree, and that can be in area of labor, it can be in the area of environment or human rights. And these initiatives, they basically they differ in their mission. Some of them, they focus on shared learning around the best practices. Others may have the more focused monitoring, or they can have a certification program. So they can differ in their mission. According to their focus, they may change, but yes, of course, they are agreeing to one point on a specific agenda where they talk. So corporate social responsibility, it includes basically a very wide range of issues. What are those issues? We have already discussed that it can relate to environment, it can relate to the child safety, it can relate to any of the major issues or concerns of the society in which you are operating. But yes, one thing is common, that most CSR initiatives, they address only a portion of them. If you ask me about the list of some of the key issues in CSR, I can present a list on that, wherein you can find that this can be a possible list of CSR activities. It can be corporate governance, and for that we have a standard called OECD Principles of Corporate Governance, OECD Convention on Countering Bribery, combating bribery, if that is your concern. OECD Convention on Countering Bribery is also there. Business principles for countering bribery is there for that. If you consider environment to be a concern, you have a standard for that, the natural step, ISO 14001. If your concern is towards labor, then of course ILO is the leading agency, leading institution. ILO tripartite declaration of principles, which concerns which is concerned with the multinational companies operating in different parts of the world, and of course the social policy as well. Social accountability, that is SA 8000. Ethical trading initiative based code, it is also concerned with the labor issues. Fair labor association code of conduct. So these are to exemplify some of them. If you take human rights, you have universal declaration of human rights also. You have guiding principles on business and human rights, health. You can have ILO code of practices on HIV and the world of work. So what I wanted to indicate here is that you can have different bases, different grounds on the basis of which we can classify these standards. And as I told you at the very outset, that according to your orientation, you can find that the same standard found place when we were talking about the classification on the basis of focus, and the same standard came when we classified the standard on the basis of the second aspect, that is the way they are being crafted or drafted, unilaterally, bilaterally or multilaterally. So with this we came to the end of this classification of these standards, and the objective was just to tell you that globally the way these CSR rules and regulations are being drafted and implemented. And the remaining part of the same topic we shall be discussing in the next lecture of mine. I hope you must have understood this very interesting aspect of CSR in today's lecture of mine. Thank you so much.